Okay, one thing left to look at with regard to American and British bombing of German cities. You can see some of the consequences in the pictures at the bottom of the screen. Devastating to many of the cities. The Allies, to their credit, worked hard to avoid hitting cultural targets like some of the major Gothic cathedrals in cities in Germany, and for more or less succeeded. Something that the Nazis tried to do some of the time, at other times not so much. But the one issue remaining is how much damage did the bombing do of the German ability to continue the war successfully? Because remember that one type of bombing, the carpet bombing, was designed to break the morale of the German people, get them to, try to pressure the Nazi government into surrendering and getting out of the war, which, as I said, probably backfired. But there was another type of bombing, the precision bombing that Americans like to do by day. And by the way, by day is more dangerous because you're more easily seen by German anti-aircraft batteries, which were numerous over these cities. The anti-aircraft fire was intense in Allied bombing raids over German cities. In fact, one of the most dangerous jobs was in the war was being on a bomber crew in one of these planes you see in the upper right. Your chances of making it through all the missions that were required before your term of duty was up were not very good. From what I recollect in reading on this subject, the only job in the American military in World War II that was more dangerous was being on a submarine in the Pacific theater of the war. But this being on a bomber crew, whether you're the pilot, the bombardier, navigator, whatever, was extremely dangerous work. But did this extensive, ongoing series of bombing raids, did it reduce the German capacity primarily to produce weapons, to produce supplies necessary to keep the war? Did it reduce, the aircraft factories, the factories producing more tanks, etc.? And the answer, I think, is yes and no to that. The one simple statistic, which I used to have on here, showed that the German production of the major weapons, like ships, planes, tanks, went up every year of the war. It went up every year in the war, regardless of the bombing, except for 1945, the last year of the war, which makes it look like then the bombing was unsuccessful in reducing the German capacity to produce, war materials and weaponry. However, I think that's misleading because one could say, and it's probably true, that though they increased the number year after year until 1945, that without the bombing, they may have increased it a lot more year by year. Either way, it's remarkable that the German people and the German military and government were able to keep producing and increasing the production under this onslaught, right? This pouring down of bombs on their heads on basically a daily basis. So now we get to Americans' involvement in the war in a more specific sense. Dwight D. Eisenhower, as I already mentioned, was eventually appointed by President Roosevelt to be Supreme Allied Commander in Europe. Actually, the title kind of evolved into that. First, it was something less than that, but this is the most important point to sort of enter. And he did have a staff around him of combined American and British generals, which was necessary and fair. The British had talented leaders as well, and this is a partnership. The Soviet Union is involved in it by now, so a three-way alliance, United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union trying to destroy the dangerous Third Reich. And it is a testimony to how potent a fighting force Nazi Germany and the Wehrmacht was. It took the combined efforts of three major powers, arguably the two most powerful countries in the world, the United States and the Soviet Union, and at least the old champion in Great Britain, still powerful but not as powerful as it had been heretofore. And it still takes them 4 years to sort of put German forces and the German war effort away. But as this alliance went on, and the British and American political and military leaders met often. I mean, these guys met every day, but the staffs from the respective countries met up in Europe and other places at various occasions to have conferences. And their relations were difficult sometimes. They disagreed on strategy a great deal, but at least they conferred regularly. The Russian ally was further away and harder to deal with. Keep in mind, it's an odd alliance in the sense that the United States and Great Britain were the leading industrial capitalist democracies of their day, and the Soviet Union was a communist country. So not natural allies at all. I mean, the Americans and British were, but not the Soviets. And this is, obvious. I mean, the reason that they could get together at all was obvious, and that is they had one common denominator, one thing in common, and that is Hitler was a menace. Nazi Germany was a menace to all of them, and they realized we can't do this alone. The amount of force unleashed by Nazi Germany is too great. So the British and Americans are cooperating here in a more distant and remote sense. There's cooperation with the Soviets and Stalin as well. But Roosevelt, Marshall, Eisenhower all recognized that British leaders are going to have to be in on this as well, in the top positions. So it's a mix of Americans and Brits. Eisenhower, you see in the center, barely, this picture's a little fuzzier than I want it to be, was a very good handler of one of the most delicate situations that he was faced with, and that is to sort of massage British egos. Because from the beginning, the Americans were the more powerful country in the alliance, but that would only increase as time went on, as America's army that George Marshall had continued to build was getting bigger and more solid, and Americans were pouring more troops into the war effort in Europe. So as time went on, the disparity between how much the United States was contributing and how much Great Britain was getting more and more unequal, which made it harder for the British then to have to be able to pressure the Americans. Nonetheless, since this was happening in Europe, Eisenhower's headquarters were in Great Britain, and the British still were an important ally. The Americans needed them on board. They had to make sure that they didn't insult the British leaders and the British public, and Eisenhower was great in ingratiating himself with the leaders, and particularly with the British public, who loved him. Actually, the leaders loved him less. Some of the British officers he got along really well with, and they liked him. Some of them were suspicious of him and didn't think much of him. But overall, he made it work in a way that was absolutely necessary. The first major campaign that Americans were involved in the European theater, the first time Dwight D. Eisenhower, in his already long distinguished career, actually commanded troops in the field. I mean, he didn't go ashore with them, but he's the guy that's the overall commander on site. He'd never commanded troops before. He'd always been a staff officer and risen to be a high staff officer, but this is his first command, and he did make mistakes, which isn't surprising for a first command. The Operation Torch, it was known, landings in German and French-occupied North Africa happened at the sites you see where the arrows are: Algiers, Oran, Casablanca. And believe it or not, at first they were mainly landing in areas that were controlled by opposing French troops. How could that be? Well, because the French had been allies when the war first started, but they got knocked out quickly. When France was occupied by Germany, some semblance of government was patched together, became known as the Vichy government, which collaborated with the Germans, the Nazis, and basically trying to sort of ingratiate themselves with the Nazis and work on their side. To some degree, at least some of them argued this, that they weren't so much as aligning with the Germans as trying to continue to have a voice in French politics. So if they're in the room somewhat cooperating with the Germans, they can get their 2 cents in and maybe protect French interests more than if they don't do that. Regardless, the French, after the war, not so much during the war, but after the war, saw the leading Vichy leaders as criminals and traitors, and a number of them were executed for betraying their country. But the Vichy government, sort of a puppet government for the Germans, instructed its troops then in North Africa to resist American and British landings. So there actually was some fighting for a short time between the British and Americans on one side and the French on the other. But this campaign was mainly designed to get the French out of the way, but then to take on the German Africa Corps, which had already been somewhat defeated by the British before the United States in the war, but end German occupation and control in North Africa, period. Professor Rourke says the North African campaign pushed the Germans out of Africa, made the Mediterranean safe for Allied shipping, and opened the door for an invasion of Italy. That it certainly did. Professor Hansen again says several scheduled Anglo-American landings in Morocco and Algeria were designed to capture the key ports at Casablanca, Oran, and Algiers. Over 100,000 British and American troops would pressure Vichy French forces to join them, which did happen, not totally successfully. This display of vast Anglo-American power would help convince Spain that it had been and should continue to be neutral. The British and American forces would soon block the German and Italian forces in Tunisia, while squeezing the Germans between the advancing and reinforced 8th Army under Montgomery, British general, kind of on the other side of North Africa here. They were kind of catching them in a pincers movement. That was the idea, which they eventually succeeded in. The American Army saw this as a warm-up for a cross-channel invasion landing the next year, but the British did not. By cross-channel invasion, and that was the phrase that was increasingly being used by planners, staff officers on American and British staffs, the idea was that they're going to, again, use Great Britain as a big staging ground for a major invasion across the English Channel from England to France and occupied Europe, Nazi-occupied Europe. The British weren't as keen on the idea. They said that they were in favor of it. Winston Churchill as Prime Minister and the British high military brass, but they kept kind of playing for time and wanted more and more operations in the meantime in the Mediterranean, and to some degree even believed that they might not even need a cross-channel invasion from England to France, and so they kept wanting to kind of land other places in the Mediterranean. Americans were always suspicious of this, rightfully so, to a certain degree, because the British had long-standing strategic interests in the Mediterranean. Also suspicious, I think rightfully so, because the British, after having suffered greatly in World War I, were loath to take too many casualties, and they knew a cross-channel invasion would sort of pile up the casualties in large numbers. Smaller operations in the Mediterranean, smaller amphibious landings, they saw as preferable, at least for the time being. But it frustrated Americans, particularly General Marshall, who at one meeting between the joint commands of both countries, the United States, Great Britain, and he was known for kind of being reserved and calm and quiet, but he did have kind of a volcanic temper the few times that it showed. But Churchill and some of the other British leaders were going on about landing troops on a small island, Rhodes, in the Eastern Mediterranean, basically the Greek world. And Churchill and again his advisors kept harping on about it, and finally Marshall exploded from the table, his side of the table, and said, "Not one American soldier is going to die on that goddamn beach in Rhodes." And what he was really saying is, we're tired of you guys trying to nickel and dime the Germans. What we need is a flat out, big time, all-encompassing invasion, and get this damn war over with. We're tired of this nitpicky stuff that you guys keep wanting to do. But they were at loggerheads over it, and the Americans again didn't have authority to kind of veto or just push aside British ideas, at least at this point. And a good example of that are the operations in Italy. Operations Husky and Avalanche, the code names. The first one on the island off the heel of the boot of Sicily, of Italy, Sicily itself, and then later in that same year, 1943, attacks on the Japanese, on the Italian mainland, which happened, and they were mainly fighting British troops with their Italian allies alongside them. German troops. It's not good when you sort of start mixing your countries in a lecture like this. Sorry. So it was mostly German troops, along with some allied Italian troops, defending the Italian peninsula against American and British forces. The campaign in Italy was brutal for the Americans and the Brits. In some ways, it was sort of like the trench warfare of the First World War. If you look at the map of Italy in the upper right, to the extent that you can see it at all, right, Italy is a long, narrow peninsula. And so there wasn't a whole lot of room for, or not nearly as much, as on in different sort of geographical situations, for creative movement. The Germans dug defensive perimeters and dug one behind another, and they sort of, when they couldn't hold one wall any longer, it wasn't literally a wall, but couldn't hold one line, as they called it, the Siegfried line. They had names for them all. They would go back to the Gustav line. I forget which ones were which, and they'd already have a pre-prepared set of defenses there. And to this ended up being a lot of head-on attacks because there were few, not no options, but few options. And Professor Rourke tells us that Allied forces continued to battle against stubborn German defenses for the remainder of the war, making the Italian campaign the war's deadliest one for American infantrymen. One soldier wrote that his buddies died like butchered swine. So this isn't very well known. I wouldn't have thought this before I read a couple of books in the last, 6-7 years, that I think more Americans died in Italy than any other place in World War II. So this was a long, difficult slog. Andrew Roberts, British historian, wrote an excellent book a few years ago on the war, says that although the attritional warfare on the Slim Peninsula had cost the 5th Army, that's General Patton's army, you see on the right, 188,000 casualties, and the 8th Army, General Montgomery's, British general's army, 123, for a total of 312,000. It had cost the Germans as many as 430,000 troops, but they'd held up the Allies, or they held them up for 19 months. They held them on this peninsula. But, on the other hand, the Allied invasion kept many German divisions away from the Western Front. So, you can look at it a number of different ways and say that the Americans and British lost this campaign in Italy, or you can say they won it, or at least it served a larger objective that was valuable, which was pinning down German troops in Italy so they couldn't be taken away and put as padding for defending the Western Wall, as it became known, which was the coming invasion. Everybody knew it was coming on both sides. A cross-channel invasion from Great Britain. Even the British basically knew, I think, that they couldn't hold out forever. By the way, George C. Marshall wanted the cross-channel invasion to happen in 1943. He got it in 1944, another compromise made, not just with the British, but some with other realities at the time. It may have been unrealistic to think that it could have gotten done, at least with success, in 1943. This is a massive undertaking. But the campaigns in North Africa and the two then in Italy, Sicily, and the southern part of the boot of Italy are getting bigger and bigger. and preparing Americans and their British allies for an eventual bigger cross-channel landing. But the British were still somewhat demurring, hemming and hawing, making excuses, wanting to nickel and dime Hitler further for the various reasons already mentioned. Not that I think we can necessarily blame them for that. Different objectives, different ways of looking at the war, different experience in World War I. Nonetheless, it got frustrating to Americans. And when the Big Three, as they're known, right, the leaders of the three major allies, Stalin of the Soviet Union, you see on the left, President Roosevelt of the U.S. in the middle, and Prime Minister Churchill of Great Britain on the right, when they met for the first of 3 times during this war at Tehran in Iran, this got settled by Stalin. Stalin had been, from the beginning, demanding that the Americans and British open up a legitimate, meaning large-sized, second front. And as late as 1943, when the conference convened in Tehran, they had yet to do so, at least to Stalin's satisfaction. He didn't think the landings in North Africa were big enough. He didn't think the landings in Italy were big enough. Big enough in what sense? Stalin expected, and you can understand why, the Russians were getting hammered day after day after day in this massive war on the Eastern Front, in Russian territory, on Russian soil, with the Germans not having to spread their forces out much at all, because the Americans and British hadn't laid down a major invasion, laid down a major front to fight a large-scale battle on yet. So Stalin's saying, start a major second front now, so that it draws German units away from me and my country, because they're all bearing down on my neck now. Force them to siphon some of those off back to the west to defend their western wall, to defend what they've taken in Western Europe. And Churchill kept bringing the subject up at Tehran, and as Gerhard Weinberg says in another fantastic, well-known book on the war, the insistence of Churchill on repeatedly returning to the charge of extended operations, on extended operations in the Mediterranean, and delays in Overlord, which was the code name for the cross-channel invasion, meant that most of the 3-4 days at the Tehran conference were taken up with arguments over strategy. Stalin now insisted that all be subordinated to Overlord. A Soviet offensive would be coordinated with the invasion. Stalin's insistence, in fact, settled the issue, and if it meant that the Soviet Union thereby settled the Anglo-American dispute, one must remember that anyone who asks a question risks receiving an answer. Having put the issue to Stalin in view of their inability to agree, the Western Allies now had his reply. The kind of snide remark there by the author is saying Churchill kept bringing it up over and over and over again, and so he had nobody to blame but himself when Stalin said, okay, you're going to keep bringing it up? All right, I'll tell you what I think. We're going to invade across the English Channel, the cross-channel invasion, none of this small-scale stuff, which was predictable. Although George C. Marshall was worried that Stalin wouldn't say that, at least in retrospect, it's predictable. Again, the Soviet Union was doing the forced to do, because Germany invaded them, the largest scale land fighting, warfare on land ever. Before or since, nothing has come close to it. The armies that were clashing, the German Wehrmacht on one side, the Soviet Red Army on the other, right, were fighting the largest land war ever. Just that part of it right there was the largest ever. So Stalin understandably wants the Americans and the British to take on, something gigantic as well, saying, look, we've been fighting, a war much bigger than anything you guys have had to contemplate. You got to do your part, which is true. The Russians were doing way more of the bleeding and dying than the Americans and the Brits were, to be sure. And finally, with Stalin's support, insistence actually, and American insistence by George Marshall, Franklin Roosevelt, Operation Overlord, the code name for the invasion of France, cross-channel invasion, was finally put into place. They were already planning it to some degree before Tehran, but now it goes into high gear. Just the logistics of this operation alone are staggering. Just to sort of pick something out, 1 million, almost 2 million tons of supplies reached Britain in May of 1944 alone, showing the titanic scale of logistics for D-Day. Eisenhower, it said, turned Britain into one gigantic airbase, workshop, storage depot, and mobilization camp. The picture in the upper right, you can see sort of just huge supply depots of stuff coming in. And this is like week after week, month after month, by air, by ships, and they're just unloading war materials of various sorts. So the planning and build-up, logistics, the supply in itself is a story, because as we already have seen and know from America's overall prowess in this war, that in an modern industrial economy, being able to outproduce and outsupply and outfund your opponents is of the essence. Eisenhower was faced with enormous pressure. He's, in my opinion, one of the greatest figures in our entire history, one of the greatest leaders in our entire history, a model, and again, this is my view, but there are plenty that agree with me, a model for how a leader, both military and political, should conduct themselves. He becomes president later on, which we'll get into, and in my opinion, he's one of our more underrated presidents, and he's one of the best presidents in our history. We'll get to that. But and his presidency was criticized a great deal by the press and others, and even his performance in World War II here as Supreme Allied Commander was and has been under scrutiny for a long time. There are some historians that believe that he was a great military leader as well as political. Again, I'm in that category myself, but there are some that think that he was sort of the wrong guy for this job, that he was too slow, too deliberate, too lumbering, didn't sort of take enough chances, didn't sort of do things creatively enough. And that, well, maybe some of that may be true, but Eisenhower was extremely good at managing personnel, managing egos, as we'll see, good with the press, as I saw, especially the British press, and that may have been his greatest attribute. But we should keep in mind that this guy didn't rise to this height just by that stuff alone. He had a keen intellect. He had all of the credentials. He'd gone to the Fort Leavenworth general officer or staff officer training school, which was like the most prestigious training an officer could get. And he had the support of a number of well-known and extremely respected officers and former officers behind him. So Eisenhower, I think, produced overall great leadership. And as the D-Day invasion was being, getting closer to the deadline, getting closer to the D-Day, the day that they disembark, he had to make tougher and tougher decisions. The picture in the middle, I don't have the clip for you. It didn't work, but it's all right. We're short of time anyway. But it's from a movie called Ike, starring Tom Selleck. I was surprised that Tom Selleck did such a good job, but I think he did, portraying Eisenhower. But Eisenhower was under tremendous pressure here, and he had to sort of do so many things at one time. And one, I forget how close to the invasion date this was, but one American general who knew him, they'd been kind of friends before the war, he got drunk and went into a crowded bar in southern England where the headquarters were, and started talking to friends or whoever about some of the plans. And word got back to Eisenhower, and by the next day, Eisenhower called him into the office and said, "You're going to have to go home, go back to the United States." And the guy was like stunned. He said, "Come on, Ike, we've been friends for a long time. How could you do this to me?" And he just said, "You don't understand. It's not personal, but we cannot afford slip-ups. None." And the guy's like, "I won't do it again. I know I shouldn't have done it." No. You can't have done it once. once is once too many. I can't take the chance. I believe you that you intend to be careful from now on, but I can't count on it now that you've made this obviously egregious slip up. And so this is the kind of decision he had to make, and those decisions got tougher. The weather was an issue. See the weather report on the right. The weather over the Channel in France was bad. Storms had been going on, and this caused all kinds of difficulties because an amphibious assault, and this is going to be the largest amphibious assault in world history, which it ended up being. Thousands of ships going across the English Channel with millions of supplies and weapons and hundreds of thousands of troops is not easy to pull off under the best of circumstances. But in stormy weather, you're looking at the potential for disaster. So they actually called the invasion off one day. I mean, a few days ahead of time. It was originally scheduled to go on June 5th. So he had to make the decision. But by June 5th, the meteorologist in charge of forecasting the weather for them, who was in an unenviable position, finally came in with some good news, saying, I guarantee that on the 6th there's going to be a clearing. The storm is going to come back eventually, but there'll be enough time, several hours, where you can land your thousands of troops and some of the supplies and establish a beachhead on the beaches of France. And Eisenhower went around the room and asked the opinion of his guys, both British and American generals. Some of them said we should go. Some of them said we should postpone. Again, set it back another day. Although they all knew that if they set it back a second day, it wouldn't be the day after that they had to go. They got to go. It would take a couple, 2 or 3 weeks. The reason being they had to do this at low tide, not high tide, and the tide was about to change and wouldn't be back to where they needed it to be for a number of weeks. It's part of the reason Eisenhower made the decision he did at that moment. As dangerous as the conditions were, as dicey as it may have been to count on weather clearing for just a short time, the element of surprise was of the absolute essence in this operation, and they'd maintained it so far. The Germans didn't know. They knew an invasion was coming. That was impossible to hide. They didn't know when and where it was coming, and that's the part that needed to stay secret. And so if you have to postpone for 2 or 3 weeks, just when you're ready to go now, it's a risk because the enemy could find out in that time, and the whole secrecy, right, doing this quietly, surprising the enemy, would be lost. So this is part of the reason that after debate over a number of minutes, Eisenhower stands up, paces the room, and finally just kind of quietly says, "Let's go," which meant we're gonna try it. We're gonna give this put this thing in operation. I don't think we can wait any longer, with or without good weather. The other big decision he had to make right on this time, something I've alluded to already, and that is his intelligence general, British general, was Ismay here. I could be wrong. Anyway, whoever the intelligence general was, his guys had predicted 70% casualties for the 3 airborne divisions. They were going to paratroop and drop behind German lines in France in the middle of the night before D-Day, and that they were going to probably take about 70% casualties. And this kind of caused everyone around the table to gulp when this decision, or when this fact came out, or this information came out. And Eisenhower said, "I'll sleep on it." And he came back the next day. This time he didn't, I think, hold the vote, go around the room so much. He listened to everybody, but he said, "Look, we have no choice. It's the landings on the beaches, getting the troops aboard, and then all the supplies, tanks and trucks and everything else we're going to need. That's the crucial part of this. If that doesn't work, the whole thing fails. If the airborne part of it fails, we still might be able to make this work, even though it'll be harder." So as this is another one of those decisions that's so often there in life, we don't like the idea, but it's true, of sort of the lesser of two evils as a choice. So he's saying, in essence, if the paratroopers, airborne divisions, have to take 70% casualties to make this invasion work, then so be it. Which wasn't an easy decision. Eisenhower was not a cruel man by any stretch. He was a quite humane person, and so this surely weighed on him. But from a rational perspective, I think it's clear that he made the right decision. If the airborne divisions didn't go, there would have been just that many more American soldiers on the beaches killed, because they wouldn't have been able to siphon off German forces behind them, having to fight the airborne divisions. So Eisenhower had to make this, incredibly hard decision, knowing that he was sending all these people off to die. The casualties didn't end up being nearly that high, by the way, though they were still high by normal standards. In the middle, you can barely see it, but you can kind of get next to your computer, stop this or replay it. I'm not going to ask you about it specifically. You see a famous letter that he wrote to the soldiers, which is, I think, quite elegant and quite moving, looking at the principles behind what they were about to do and why they were doing it. He also wrote a remarkable letter, too. This shows what a person Eisenhower was. You can see that I respect this leader immensely. He wrote a letter that said, in so many words, he wrote the letter like the invasion had failed, and then put it in an envelope, sealed it, handed it to one of his subordinates, and said, "Hold on to this, and if we fail, put it in the mail." Right? I don't want to have it in my hands. You take charge of it, but if this invasion fails, put it in the mail. And the letter said, "We've lost. It's been a terrible blow to us, etc., etc., and it's all my fault. It's not the fault of the soldiers. It's not the fault of my staff. It's all my fault. I failed." How many people in this day and age, particularly leaders, will take that kind of responsibility and willing to take that kind of criticism on themselves deliberately? Remarkable. The longest day, as remarked by General Rommel, the German general who was legendary by this time, in charge of figuring out how to defend occupied France. Once again, the Germans knew that an invasion was coming. They knew it was going to be in France or near France, and it was Rommel's unenviable task and job to try to figure out where the Americans and Brits would land, but he had to kind of spread out his forces because he couldn't be certain. So he had to defend, in a sense, all of the French coastline, and France has lots of coastline, and figure out how to do that without spreading forces too thin. A lot of what he did, was have tank units, which can move fast and lots of firepower, sort of hang back behind the coastline in a strategic position so they could move in a number of directions. If the landing comes here or there, either way they could move there in a certain fairly short amount of time, and hopefully, from the German point of view, repel the invasion. So the largest amphibious assault in human history, in the upper right, you see that's after troops have been successfully landed, because they wouldn't be offloading all those trucks and jeeps and that close together. Or those big ships wouldn't be there if the fighting was going on the beach. So they cleared the beaches by that time, but it gives you some sense of the scale of this operation. You see German pillbox defenders, bunker defenders on the left. The Americans landed at 5 beachheads: Gold, Omaha Beach, Utah Beach, where American troops landed; Gold, Sword, and Juno, where British and Canadian troops landed. And as luck would have it, or bad luck, it was those beachheads. By those names, of course, were code names, not the French names. But in 4 of the 5 beachheads, on 4 of the 5, the resistance for the Germans was relatively light. So within a couple hours, the forces were all moving miles inland already. But on Omaha Beach, one of the 2 American beaches, as luck would have it, or bad luck, they met huge resistance from the Germans. And so it was on Omaha Beach where the most savage fighting took place on that day. And The invasion troops coming in on landing craft and splashing through the water up the beach on Omaha and everywhere else came in waves. The first wave came early in the morning, and then I don't know, an hour later another one. And by the third wave, the officers that came aboard in the third wave were shocked when they saw, number one, the troops hadn't moved past the beach. There was a low seawall, sort of at the end of the beach, that everybody was like lying behind, stunned, and everybody looked kind of in shock, and nobody was really leading. Even the officers seemed to be just lethargic, and so a number of the officers in the third wave started to sort of take charge, realizing this is not a tenable situation. One of them famously saying, "The only people on this beach are the dead and those that are going to die. Now let's get the hell out of here." He recognized something there that's implied in the statement, I think, and it's I think something that's said in warfare, military circles all the time, and that is that you're better off moving. All things being equal anyway, you're better off moving than sitting still. Part of the reason for that, the main reason, and that's what this officer was attesting to, is that if you stay in one place, it gives the enemy time to figure out your coordinates and your location. It's just math. And they call this, or they used to call it zeroing. And once they zero on your position, it's just math. They've just sort of, now they can set their artillery fire and their mortar fire and sort of rain down a very accurate fire because they know your exact location and position. So this guy recognized, among other things that were problematic about it, that we need to get out of here before they zero us and we all get blown to bits. But 7,000 ships went across that day, 155,000 soldiers, 3,700 fighter planes, 1,400 transport planes, approximately 10,000 American, British, and Canadian troops killed, 2,500 killed or missing, 7,500 wounded. 6,600 of those Americans, mostly on Omaha Beach, which again was bloody, difficult fighting. By the end of the day, some of those officers just alluded to found some seams in the German bunkers and defensive systems and exploited them, and by the end of the day they managed to push the German forces off the beach. But by the end of the day on the other beaches, they were already sort of 5-10 miles inland, so Omaha was the difficulty. I have a video clip here from Saving Private Ryan. Some of you may have seen it. The first scene is harrowing to watch. It shows the landings at Omaha Beach, and it does give you a certain sense of how gruesome all of this was. It is pretty graphic if you look it up on your own. I warn you of that now. But, and I'm not saying that a movie can ever truly give you an understanding of what it must feel like to be in such a situation. But I didn't like the rest of the movie, by the way, but the technical part of it in this scene is tremendous. But after taking the beaches and going a few miles inland, the battle had just begun. The month-long battle for Normandy, as it's often referred to in the summer of 1944, was a vicious one. And American and British forces had to fight for every house, every town, every road, every hedgerow, because the Germans tenaciously defended. The Americans slowly pushed them back, but very slowly with lots of loss of life. The Allies committed 39 divisions to the Battle of Normandy, 22 American, 12 British, 3 Canadian, 1 Polish, and 1 French, totaling over 1 million troops. 1 million troops fighting across sort of northwestern France. The hedgerows, you can see in the upper right and the middle, upper middle, what were called hedgerows. Much of French countryside was sort of lined with these hedgerows, which are like really thick thickets of bushes at the sides of roads, sometimes just dividing one farmer's field from another. But it made it difficult because you oftentimes couldn't know what was on the other side of the hedgerow so easily. And so it kind of made the fighting extra kind of piece by piece, road by road, field by field, because you have to sort of get, sometimes take shelter behind a hedgerow, then get through it and go around it, push the other enemy's troops back if they're there. So the hedgerows made this fighting extra hard to do. Finally, after the end of the month and into the summer, the Americans and the Brits on the farthest right side of their lines had a breakthrough or breakout. This became known as the Falaise Pocket. And you can see in the map on the left, it basically surrounded a number of large German units. Although you can also see that the circle didn't totally close, and so some of those units escaped. If they put the circle around them completely, there would have a lot more damage been done. Nonetheless, 10,000 German soldiers killed, 50,000 captured in the Falaise Pocket, battle or episode. So this is really what turned the Battle of Normandy from, in a sense, a slow slugfest into a breakout. And now they raced, American, British, Canadian troops raced towards Paris, which they liberated on August 25th, 1944. A bittersweet moment, as it says, because Charles de Gaulle, their leader from exile in London, carried on a Free French government, Free French movement, rapidly becoming a hero, later going to be Prime Minister of France after the war on a number of occasions. But he sort of got pride of place by entering first, and bittersweet because, as it says on the slide, hundreds of resistance leaders, guys who carried out kind of underground guerrilla warfare against the Germans in Paris and France, were killed as the Germans were being forced out of and retreating from Paris. And you see, of course, American troops marching down the Champs-Élysées, which overall was a happy day for the French, certainly, but for the Allied troops as well, since capturing Paris was a pretty big prize. In September of that same year, General Montgomery, one of the many egos that Eisenhower had to put up with, and he had a massive one, proposed a risky plan, which became known, the code name Operation Market Garden, which would become the largest airborne assault in history. If you've noticed, World War II has the largest of this and that, lots of them, but it still remains the largest in history. The three airborne divisions we talked about before, 2 American and 1 British, were slated to make it this done. But in a sense, it was an attempt to do an end run around the German lines in the north in Holland, on the right side of the German line, by landing large numbers of paratroopers who would secure bridgeheads and hold on to them until this huge column of troops and tanks and all the weapons would sort of come up a road. You can see in the bottom left of the map where it says Belgium, there's a little black arrow to the left of the word Belgium. It's that road from there that this massive column of infantry and weaponry was going to come and get there, after the 82nd Airborne, 101st Airborne, 1st Airborne of the British had sort of held these positions for them and cleared bridges for them. And many leaders, particularly Americans, because Montgomery was a Brit, thought it was stupid. And there was, even though the Allies got along well enough, the Americans and British, to make this war work, and there were some legitimate good feeling and some friendships formed, there also was a lot of animosity. And American leaders and soldiers tended not to think very much of Montgomery, though Montgomery did. Again, Montgomery was a piece of work, and it was a bad idea, and it can be blamed maybe mostly on Dwight Eisenhower. He signed off on it. He could have said, no, that's idiotic, we're not doing that. He may have done it so reluctantly in letting it go, but let it go he did, and this ended up being a disaster. So the plan failed for many, many reasons. There's much stiffer German resistance, and they had the reconnaissance had told them that's part of it. There are others as well, but this set back the push across France into Belgium, into the Ardennes forests in Luxembourg, and into Germany. It set it back by a number of months, and so this ended up being a problem. And from that point forward, Eisenhower got cautious. He tended to be pretty cautious anyway. But this was a daring plan that failed, and Eisenhower didn't really like daring anyway. Now was going to keep this cautious. The leadership, again, having to deal with the egos, primarily 2. who clashed with each other a lot under Eisenhower's nose as subordinates, but there were other egos as well that were difficult to manage. But Dwight Eisenhower was great at managing people and sort of knowing, sort of how to deal with their egos. He was actually personal friends, and had been for years, with General Patton on the right. Always carried a pistol at his side. Patton, a known hard ass. He's an American hero. He came out of this war here, even though he died at the end of the war in a vehicle crash. But considered one of sort of America's great generals. But he was a handful. He was egotistical. He was loud. He could be obnoxious. He was arrogant. He thought he knew better than Eisenhower, his boss. And the same was true of Montgomery. You see on the left, conferring with Eisenhower as well. But he always thought that he knew, what he was right, and that Eisenhower, he thought, was inexperienced and only a staff officer. But Eisenhower, I think, handled them deftly and brilliantly. Eisenhower was a man who led by understatement most of the time. There were times where he knew he had to get tough and demonstrative, and did, but he led more by indirection, which I think is smart. When it can be done, it probably should be done that way. David Kennedy, in a classic work of history in Freedom from Fear, says Montgomery formally proposed to Eisenhower that he be given all the resources needed to launch a powerful and full-blooded thrust towards Berlin that would end the war. Patton, meanwhile, thundered that if Ike stops holding Monty's hand and gives me the supplies, I'll go through the Siegfried line like shit through a goose. Patton was known for his rather inflammatory statements and this kind of spicy language and sort of just dramatic, energetic personality. But what they're basically both saying is there were three armies basically moving forward. Hodges in the center, who I don't see pictures here. The guy in the upper right, by the way, I couldn't find a picture of these three primaries together. The guy in the upper right is Omar Bradley, another hero on the American side on this war, and a trusted officer of Eisenhower. So Hodges' army is in the middle, Montgomery's army is on the left flank, and Patton's is on the right. And they're both saying, hey, give me on the left flank or right flank, respectively, most of the supplies, most of the weapons, most of the money, and let me do an end run on the enemy, and I'll win this war, like overnight. And they were both extremely confident that they could and would do so. But you have to wonder, and I think the answer is pretty obvious, whether or not they were doing this more because they thought it was really the way to end the war, or were they doing it as much or more because they wanted to get the glory, certainly more than the other guy. This isn't the first time they were in competition with each other, and sort of who does more to defeat the Germans, who gets more of the accolades and hero worship. So these guys had gigantic personalities, egos, and Eisenhower reined them in. And as boring as it was, and some historians even now still criticize him for it, he said, no, we're going to go straight forward now. Right? 3 yards in a cloud of dust. No more of these end-run things. Market Garden was a disaster. So none of the three armies are going to move basically without the others sort of being right in a similar position. If one gets too far ahead, it's going to be asked to slow down until the other three can kind of come up to the same level. So this is now very methodical and step by step. But the Americans and the British got complacent. They got overconfident, including Eisenhower. Just as they'd pushed the German forces out of France in the Ardennes forest primarily, which is basically where Luxembourg is, in the middle of winter, as you see here, when the Americans, the Allies, thought that they'd won the war. The Germans can't do anything, they have no offensive capability. So they thought. Hitler was a gambler. I should have kept that in mind, because he unleashed a massive German surprise offensive known as the Battle of the Bulge. Why the Bulge? Because it poked a hole in the Allied lines 55 miles deep. They drove 55 miles back the other way. And the Americans eventually, and the British patch this up, but it wasn't easy and it was somewhat frightening, though Eisenhower saw it as more of an opportunity than anything else, since the bulge meant that German forces that are in that pocket that's advanced are now kind of sticking out. If we attack them from both sides, both kind of corners of that pocket, we can cut them off, surround them, and make it a turkey shoot and get lots of prisoners to boot. In the end, Montgomery primarily didn't follow orders, so they didn't end up catching them. But they won the battle. At least they won it in the sense that the German, in some ways, desperation invasion, surprise offensive, in the end didn't break through and was repulsed. The battle counts really as the largest battle in American history. 600,000 or more Americans were engaged at one time or another. 70,000 Allied soldiers killed. 20,000 of them were British at the Battle of the Bulge. So one scholar has said in a recent book that for the German offensive at the Battle of the Bulge to have worked and pushed legitimately pushed the Allies sort of back and sort of put them on the defensive, everything would have to break just right. Everything. And when they first started, a number of things did break right, but the odds were against every single thing happening in their favor with so many different factors. The next step really was crossing the Rhine River with, again, some semblance of balance between the three armies. And if you've ever been to Germany and the Rhine River, it's big and very wide. So this wasn't easy to do with the Germans defending and on the other side of it. But eventually they found a bridge, as Childers says in the Third Reich. On March 7th, 1945, American troops found the only remaining intact bridge over the Rhine at a place called Remagen, 15 miles south of Cologne, and poured across. 3 weeks later, all Allied armies were across the Rhine. The last natural barrier to the interior of Nazi Germany was gone. So once they got across the Rhine, and there was a lot of casualties, killed, wounded doing this as well, but now the end was near. This is basically going to be over. I should go back. By this time, the Soviet Red Army, which had been on its heels at the beginning of the war, when Germany first invaded in June of 1941, by early 1943, the Russians and the Soviet Red Army had sort of turned the tide and were gradually pushing German forces out of the Soviet Union. The turning point is usually seen to be the Battle of Stalingrad in the winter of 42 and 43, when an entire German army was annihilated after being surrounded in the fall and winter of that year. And some of the most vicious fighting of the whole war happened in the city of Stalingrad, which was reduced to rubble over months of fighting, hand to hand, apartment building to apartment building, factory to factory, city battle that took months. But it's often said that after Stalingrad, from that point forward, the Germans were gradually on the downside, and I think that's true. But it says something again about the German military presence and proclivity for military operations that the Wehrmacht had, that it still took so long. By early 43, they had the advantage after Stalingrad, but the war doesn't end until May of 1945. That's still over 2 years, but that's of course true. The big three met again for the second time at Yalta, which is in the Crimean. So they went to Stalin's house this time for the meeting. All of them looking a bit older. Certainly Roosevelt was. He was in poor health by this time and only a few months away from death. He didn't know that, of course. Weinberg says the three allies trying hard for an accommodation of divergent ideologies and interests, with the great problem being that some of the agreements reached were not afterwards carried out, so that the high water mark of cooperation was followed by new crises rather than more steps toward continued working together. Yalta did established some things of importance for the remaining war effort, but it also showed that the alliance between the big three was not likely to survive the war, that the interests and ideologies and differences were just too great between the Americans and the British on one side and the Soviet communists on the other side. General Eisenhower could have pushed his troops to capture Berlin before the Russians got there. Right? Another prize. The prize of the war was capturing Berlin and hopefully Hitler alive. And Eisenhower, it was his decision to make. Eisenhower had unique authority in his hands. He got complaints all the time about subordinates and others that didn't think he was doing a good job and didn't agree with his orders. And they go over his head to General Marshall or President Roosevelt, and especially Marshall, but both of them would always just say, go see Eisenhower, go see Ike. We trust him. We put all authority in his hands. What he says goes. So you couldn't go over him, his head, because he had the support of those above him. But he decided not to attack or not to push hard to get to Berlin. Partially the Russians were there, were closer anyway, so it was more likely that they would make it first. Even if we do make an all-out effort, we'll still probably fail. But there was something else I think involved in this too. And Eisenhower got criticized for this big time. How could you let the Russians get there first? They're our allies, but we don't like them, and we want to get the glory and the credit for capturing Berlin and Hitler. Well, Eisenhower realized something that ended up being true. The battle for Berlin was going to be a titanic battle, and there was going to be huge loss of life. So why do we need to do this? And from the American vantage point, the American viewpoint, which certainly wasn't totally wrong, as cruel as it may be, they thought, well, the Russians are used to taking losses. They've lost millions in this war. They don't seem to care, so let them do it one more time. And we can sort of save American lives and let the Soviets do the dirty work in Berlin, which is what happened. Thomas Childers talking about Hitler's girlfriend and wife, who he married in the underground bunker, the Fuhrer bunker, where he lived in the last weeks underneath Berlin, while it was being pummeled by Russian artillery. Aircraft. Eva Braun, her name, wanted to celebrate when they're in the bunker, that is. They couldn't get out. There's just Soviet artillery and around shells bursting everywhere. But she wanted to celebrate when there was nothing to celebrate. Dancing, drinking, forgetting. Flowers adorned the large circular table Speer, one of Hitler's henchmen, had designed for her. Champagne flowed. Cigarette smoke clouded the room. Giddy laughter bubbled through throughout the crowd. An ancient phonograph materialized, but only one record could be found. It played over and over again. Dancing and intimacies were everywhere, interrupted only briefly by a loud explosion nearby. Eva wanted to dance, and it didn't matter with whom. The determination to realize the oppressive tension, to release the oppressive tension that jungled their nerves was an almost physical presence in the room. Artillery fire continued to thump all around them. The music could not drown out this frantic scene, so bizarrely out of place under the circumstances. Eva Braun, Hitler's girlfriend, remarried again just before they committed suicide together here at this time. They went sort of upstairs from the bunker because they were so sick of being kept in at nighttime, and Eva Braun kind of put on a party, put on music, and she's dancing, but most people are kind of standing around uncomfortably because they know it's dangerous and it's weird considering this is life or death, and she's dancing and smiling and laughing, and sure enough an artillery shell goes off and everybody ends up running back into the bunker. There's a great movie, which would be a great extra credit film. If you haven't seen it, you should, not just for this class, but it would be a great one to do for extra credit. Write me a review of the historical accuracy of the film, which is always the extra credit assignment. It's called Downfall. It was done about 10 years ago in Germany, and it's German with English subtitles. But the guy who plays Hitler, it's astonishing. I've seen movies where Hitler was portrayed before, and I always look at it like, that's not Hitler. That's a guy with like a cheesy mustache that sort of looks like Hitler. But this guy, German actor, pretty well known, looks like him, sounds like him, screams like him. His eyes sort of look like him. You almost kind of forget that it's not Hitler. So in some ways, it's a terrifying movie, but it's an extremely well done one. It's also depressing too, because of the bizarre incidents that took place in the Fuhrer bunker underneath Berlin here. So keep that in mind if you do watch it. I've given you a trigger warning.